Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to understanding the complex forces shaping our world. Today, we're diving deep into something that, well, it touches everyone. Data, power, and the future of surveillance. It's huge. You might have seen articles like The Economist's piece, China is building an entire empire on data. That really sparked our thinking. And the central question for you today is this. How are nations, especially China and the US, using these vast amounts of data? And maybe more importantly, what are the implications? For privacy, sure, but also for innovation, even for safety on our streets.
It's absolutely a critical global trend. And our mission today really is to unpack these complex, often hidden mechanisms of state-controlled data systems. We'll focus quite a bit on China's approach, which is, well, unique. But then, crucially, we'll compare that with what's happening, how things are evolving in liberal democracies like the U.S., and we have to ask that question. Are these different paths actually starting to converge? We're pulling from a range of sources here, aiming for a nuanced, fact-based understanding.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with China's data empire, and maybe the most well-known piece. The social credit system, the SCS. Now, when people hear that term, often they picture like a single score dictating everything, right? Almost like that Black Mirror episode, Nosedive. But what's the reality on the ground? Is it really that simple?
No, it's definitely more nuanced than that single score idea. What the sources tell us is the SCS is actually quite decentralized. It's still evolving. And it's basically a program to collect data on all sorts of things: regulatory compliance, taxes, court judgments, civic behavior. For businesses and individuals, the main goal, to figure out who's trustworthy and, frankly, to enforce certain behavior. So, yeah, think less monolithic score, more a fragmented but still very powerful system of, let's say, carrots and sticks.
Right, carrots and sticks. And for individuals, those carrots and sticks really shape everyday life, don't they? You mentioned Snowden County, starting with 1,000 points. What kind of rewards are we talking about for good behavior?
Oh, tangible stuff. Real benefits. We're talking things like jumping the queue for public housing, tax breaks, getting loans or credit more easily, even priority for school admissions or getting a job. And then there are, daily life perks, shorter waits at hospitals, free gym access. It's about making trustworthiness pay, literally.
But then there's the stick. And the consequences for a low score sound pretty severe.
They are very severe. By 2019, there were reports, I think, around 23 million people blacklisted from flights or high-speed trains. That's a massive restriction on movement. Low scores can also block access to credit, public services. You might even be ineligible for government jobs. There was this really stark case in 2018. A student denied university admission because their father was on a debtor blacklist. It cuts deep.
Wow. And it goes beyond just practical restrictions, doesn't it? There's this element of public shaming, too.
Yeah, but with a very digital, modern twist. It's not just a private note on a file. We're taking names, photos, ID numbers of blacklisted people displayed online or even on big public screens. And in some places, if you call someone who's blacklisted, you might get a recorded message saying you're dialing a dishonest debtor. It's designed to ostracize.
That's incredible. So what specific things affect your score? What gains or loses you points?
It's a huge range of behaviors. You can gain points for, say, praising the government online, avoiding groups labeled as cults. You lose points for traffic violations, drunk driving, jaywalking is often cited. Also, spreading rumors online, giving what the authorities deem an insincere apology if you've committed a crime. Even things like cheating in online games can count against you. It's really trying to steer behavior across the board.
And you mentioned it's not just individuals. Businesses are rated, too. How does that work? That seems critical for the economic angle.
Absolutely crucial. Take Zhejiang province as an example. They break it down into 5 categories for businesses. You've got the obvious ones: basic data, who runs the company; operations; finance and taxation debts, taxes, social insurance payments; then governance, product quality, safety, environmental stuff, compliance penalties, criminal conduct. But the 5th one is fascinating: social responsibility.
Social responsibility?
Yeah.
How is that different?
Well, unlike the others where you mostly lose points for bad behavior, here, points are added for good behavior. Things like getting awards from government bodies, making charitable donations that align with policy. And interestingly, politically connected firms often tend to score higher in this category. It kind of nudges companies to toe the party line. Plus, these blacklists interlock. Get blacklisted by one agency, others might follow. And these can last up to 5 years. It makes it incredibly hard for business to recover. It's a tight net.
So how on earth do they manage all this data? The scale seems immense. What's the technological foundation?
It rests on a massive digital infrastructure. You can trace its roots back to the Golden Shield project, which started way back in 1998. That laid a lot of the groundwork.
Okay, golden shield. And what's built on top of that now?
Systems like the police cloud.
Yeah.
This thing integrates just unbelievable amounts of personal data, residential addresses, family trees, religious affiliations, hotel stays, flight records, train records, biometric data, CCTV footage, even e-commerce purchases and transactions. The aim, well, officially it's crime prediction, but also identifying potential dissent.
And that ties into these smart city projects we hear about.
Exactly. They often feature something called a city brain. It's like a digital twin of the city. It visualizes police patrols, pedestrian flows, vehicle movements in real time. It can pull data from prisons, even detect unusual gatherings of people in buildings using platforms like Huawei's eSight. It's incredibly integrated.
And biometrics are central to this, right? Fingerprints, faces.
Mandatory collection is key. Visa applications need photos, all 10 fingerprints. Since 2017, Chinese citizens entering the country have to do an in-person facial scan, provide fingerprints too. Plus, real name registration for all SIM cards, all internet access. And we saw during COVID, police using AI-powered smart helmets for temperature checks and facial recognition on the spot.
It sounds incredibly high-tech, almost automated, but you mentioned there's a human layer too, this grid system.
Yes, that's important. It's not all just algorithms. You have these neighborhood workers, often not official government employees acting as local eyes and ears. They monitor their assigned area, report issues, and get this, their performance is actually rated based on preventing citizen complaints from escalating into, say, protests or collective action. So it's this blend of high-tech surveillance and very localized human monitoring.
Which brings up a huge question. How is this accepted by the public, such pervasive surveillance?
That's a fascinating point. There was a study, quite revealing, where 19 out of 22 participants actually said they thought internet censorship was necessary. They used phrases like promoting positive energy or ensuring national stability. So, for many, it seems surveillance has somehow been reframed. It's seen less as an intrusion and more as a perceived social good, something needed for order and safety.
But there's a profoundly dark side to this, isn't there? When we look at Xinjiang, it becomes a stark example of data weaponized.
A deeply concerning example, yes. Since late 2016, the Uyghur population and other Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang, about 13 million people have faced, well, human rights groups call it mass arbitrary detention, forced political indoctrination, severe movement restrictions, religious suppression. Credible estimates suggest maybe up to 1 million people have been held in these political education camps.
And technology, specifically data analysis, plays a central role in this.
A central role. There's this app, the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, or IJDP. It pulls data from everywhere, checkpoints, cameras, phone usage, everything, to flag individuals deemed potentially threatening. Those people are then targeted for detention.
What kind of things does it flag?
It collects incredibly detailed personal info, even your car color or height linked to your ID. And it flags everyday behaviors as suspicious. Things like not socializing enough with neighbors, avoiding your front door, using a VPN or encrypted chat apps, having unusual electricity usage patterns, or even just leaving your registered home area without permission. It also flags whole categories of people, anyone getting a new phone number, people with relatives overseas, or relatives who've gone missing. It's incredibly broad.
And the real-world impact is immediate and devastating for those flagged.
Absolutely chilling. We hear stories like Alim, who couldn't enter public places because orange alarms went off at mall security checks, or Nur's family being constantly stopped and questioned at checkpoints simply because of family connections flagged by the system. And crucially, this happens without any warning, no explanation, and no way to appeal or correct the record.
So, pulling back a bit, does all this data collection give China an edge economically, specifically in artificial intelligence?
It seems to, yes. China's rise in AI research development and commercial use has been incredibly rapid. It's driven by several factors, a dynamic entrepreneurial class, international partnerships, and very targeted government support.
And there's this idea of an AI surveillance symbiosis. How does that work?
Right. Basically, Chinese tech companies get a huge commercial boost by winning government contracts for public security systems. These contracts essentially unlock access to enormous, diverse data sets from the population data they might really struggle to get otherwise. And having that massive amount of real-world data is like rocket fuel for AI development, especially things like facial recognition, where more data means better algorithms.
So the surveillance state actually helps build the AI industry.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And the numbers seem to bear it out. China-based inventors are filing the most generative AI patents way ahead of other countries. Think Tencent, Ping An, Baidu. And Gen AI has huge potential, right? Drug discovery, autonomous vehicles. It's also quite telling that spending on public security AI tends to spike right after periods of social unrest. Local officials are clearly incentivized to deploy this tech for stability maintenance, which helps their careers.
Okay, let's pivot now. Let's look at the U.S. surveillance landscape. How different is it, really? The narrative is often about liberal democracies being different, but is that the full picture?
It's definitely a different picture, but maybe more complex than we sometimes think. There's been this ongoing struggle for transparency, particularly after the Snowden leaks back in 2013.
Right, Snowden kicked off a huge debate. Were there actual reforms?
There were. The big one was the 2015 USA Freedom Act that specifically ended the NSA's daily bulk collection of domestic phone metadata under Section 215 of the Patriot Act. That was a direct response to the outcry.
So bulk collection of phone records stopped. Problem solved.
Well, not quite. The government found other ways, apparently, to collect hundreds of millions of phone records anyway. And then in 2018, the NSA actually had to delete millions of records they admitted were collected improperly. So it highlights this ongoing tension, this imperfect push for accountability.
What about other programs? Section 702 keeps coming up. What is that?
Section 702 of FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, that's a huge one. It allows the government to target foreigners located outside the U.S. for surveillance. But the controversy comes because it incidentally sweeps up communications of Americans who are talking to those foreign targets. And this happens without a traditional warrant. The scale is mind-boggling. In just 1 year, 2021, the FBI reportedly conducted up to 3.4 million searches of this Section 702 data, specifically looking for Americans' communications. And audits have found widespread violations of even the minimal privacy rules that are supposed to apply. This affects programs like PRISM and Upstream.
PRISM and Upstream. Those were big names from the Snowden files. And there's more beyond Section 702.
Yes, there's Executive Order 12333. A lot of NSA spying overseas happens under this authority. And again, it impacts Americans whose communications get caught in that net and analyzed, sometimes using powerful tools like Xkeyscore. That's the tool Snowden described as letting analysts watch basically anything a person does on the internet in real time. It raises serious questions about oversight. And this connects directly to another huge issue, the blurring lines between the data companies collect and government access. Bruce Schneier, the security expert, nailed it. Surveillance is the business model of the internet.
Right. So companies collect vast amounts of data for profit.
And then the government can potentially access it. There was a Reddit discussion that really hit this point hard. The sentiment was basically, what's the difference between state and corporate surveillance anymore? The argument being, the government can often just buy data from commercial data brokers. It creates this cycle where data just flows between corporate and state hands.
Are there concrete examples of that happening?
Yes. For instance, reports show ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement paid millions to data brokers like LexisNexis for personal information used in deportation efforts. And at the same time, companies like LexisNexis are lobbying against stronger privacy laws. It really underscores the need, as some policymakers argue, for things like algorithmic transparency, stronger privacy rules, and maybe even treating U.S. citizens' data as a national security asset, perhaps with export controls.
And the COVID-19 pandemic seemed to accelerate some of these trends, drawing uncomfortable parallels with China.
It really did. In the U.S., we saw debates and implementation around vaccine passports, contact tracing apps, various movement restrictions, all justified for public health. But it undeniably led to concerns about privacy and free speech suffering. And it echoed in some ways how China used its health code system to control movement and enforce stability during the pandemic.
Which brings us back to that common refrain. If you have nothing to hide, why do you need privacy? How do you counter that?
It's a pervasive argument, but I think the counter is quite simple and intuitive. Why do you put blinds on your windows? Why do you lock your door? It's not usually because you're doing something illicit. It's about controlling your personal space, deciding who gets to see what. Most people wouldn't just post their credit card statements online for everyone to see, even if they swear they have nothing to hide. There's an inherent desire for a private sphere, even if we don't always articulate it as a fundamental right.
Okay, so putting it all together, the big question, are the U.S. and China actually becoming more alike in how they monitor citizens, especially with AI getting so powerful so fast?
That's the really uncomfortable question, isn't it? You can definitely see parallels. Regardless of the political ideology, democracy versus authoritarianism, you end up with a similar functional outcome in some respects. Pervasive data collection, significant state access to that data, and often a degree of public acceptance justified by safety or convenience. So the how of surveillance, the tools and techniques, They do seem to be converging, even if the stated why the political justification remains quite different.
And some observers are quite blunt about this potential convergence.
They are. You hear experts and even just discussions online saying that U.S. technological capabilities are easily on par with or even better than China's. Some argue the U.S. already have all the technical pieces needed for a terrifying authoritarian surveillance state. It just lacks the political will or, as one comment put it, the right fascist behind the wheel. There's even speculation, perhaps unfounded but telling, that the NSA might already have assigned some kind of internal social credit score to every American. It shows the anxiety about where things could lead.
So let's tackle a direct comparison that listeners might be talking about. Does China's, well, draconian approach actually make its streets safer than American streets?
That's a really tough comparison. Chinese officials certainly point to successes. They reported, for instance, solving 100,000 crimes in Guangdong province by 2012 using surveillance cameras. And that human grid system we talked about, where local workers address grievances or give warnings, that likely does play a role in preventing some minor issues from escalating into major social unrest.
But at what cost?
Exactly. That perceived safety comes alongside the massive human rights concerns we discussed, especially in Xinjiang. When possessing common religious materials can get you flagged as violent and terrorist and lead to interrogation or detention, that's an incredibly high price for perceived order.
And how does the U.S. compare in terms of safety and accountability?
Well, the U.S. obviously faces significant challenges with crime and safety, but the key difference lies in accountability and avenues for challenge. While surveillance exists and is often controversial, there are still legal and political mechanisms to push back. We see federal courts issuing rulings requiring warrants for certain searches, like those backdoor searches of Section 702 data. It's an imperfect, often slow struggle through the courts, through public debate, through attempts at legislative reform like the USA Freedom Act. But the struggle can happen. Individuals can sue, challenge surveillance, seek redress.
So the core difference isn't necessarily the capability to surveil, but the legal framework and the possibility of pushback.
That seems to be a critical distinction. What's fascinating and quite stark is how Chinese law actively requires companies to cooperate with state security agencies. There's essentially no legal way for a company to refuse a data request. Contrast that with the U.S., where the focus, however imperfectly realized, is still on trying to establish legal limits, warrants, transparency, and oversight.
So final thoughts, are we converging or not?
I think it's fair to say both nations are deeply entangled in data-driven societies now. The technologies are becoming more similar. But the fundamental intent, the level of transparency, and crucially, the avenues for citizens to challenge state power, those still diverge significantly. The U.S. isn't building an explicit, all-encompassing social credit system like China's, but the way corporate data collection merges with government access, powered by increasingly sophisticated AI, that definitely raises uncomfortable questions about privacy's future and warrants serious ongoing vigilance from all of us.
Okay, so we've journeyed through China's vast data empire, looked at its impact on AI, and then contrasted that with the complex, often contentious surveillance situation in the U.S. We've explored those unsettling parallels, but also the vital distinctions.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, maybe here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Given this relentless march of AI, given these blurring lines between the data companies want and the data governments can access, how do you think societies, any society, can realistically balance that fundamental desire for security and order with the equally fundamental right to individual privacy and freedom? It's a huge balancing act, and the honest truth is, we're all still figuring it out. It's a question that's only going to get more urgent.